Thank you, Catherine.
I want to say something. It is in relation to what we're doing here tonight. I ran a film library of the National Film Board in Lima, Peru, from 58 till 64.
Wow.
And I want to tell you, Norman McLaren's films were amazing. We had seminars on the film Neighbors, and so I was a fan of this marvelous National Film Board for years. I had a projector at the time. I had a 16 millimeter projector that I learned to work, and the ambassador gave me one, so I had it at home, and I was able to look at all the films. Then I had to make a little catalog and translate the story into Spanish. We learned to splice the films, and so I had a lending library, just to tell you that people came from all over Peru to borrow the National Film Board films. We sent them to the jungle. We sent, I remember a film called Living Stone, many of these wonderful, wonderful films. So I just had to say something, and it was a treat meeting you. And the contrast, Alex, of what you are doing and of us watching Blinkety Blank, Le Merle, and all those that were part of how we grew up with animation of the film board. Anyway, thank you for this evening.
Oh, thank you.
I went to Torino Turin in 1982 for a McLaren weekend, and I showed a lot of McLaren films, and there was an amazing moment where there was all these famous Italian animators did a session. They showed their first films, and they were all copies, as it were, of National Film Board animation. And the story was, they said that they had they'd grown up on Disney, and all of a sudden there was all these films that came from Canada, and so they copied them. And I remember there was this crazy Italian animator who was very famous, Bruno Bozzetto, and he had done a remake of Neighbors, but he had done it as a chess game.
Wow.
And it was very strange, but all the films, were using techniques they picked up from National Film Board films, and so the Film Board was a huge influence. I remember I went to Mumbai, and I showed all 60 of McLaren's films, and I had a screening, not of all of them. It was 4.5 hours long, in a cinema which had 1,200 people, and the people were all, the seats were filled. They were sitting in the aisles, they were standing. Nobody left.
Wow.
And they just watched these, and they kept, after each film, they would start, having things to say. It was an extraordinary experience to see the impact, and to discover firsthand the reputation of the film board overseas. And back to the business of the traveling projections, when you think that Canada in the war had a population of between 11 and 12 million people, and yet 1.5 million Canadians saw an NFB film each month. These projectionists went everywhere in their cars and their trucks, and showing films in schools and libraries and and taverns and whatnot, and factories, and so the film board is an important part of Canada's history, and an important part of our national unity. Please.
Yeah, I have a question earlier. So you were saying that you kind of find the story as you go along. The question for Leslie, really, I used to work in production, but I'm more of a creative. How do both of
I mean, my experience is obviously much more, the last decade. So I mean, I think that one common, the thing here, I think that could be appreciated is again this idea of culture that isn't necessarily responding to the pressures of an industry, right? So I think that's really that's when it gets kind of weird, because it's easier to tell yourself, well, I'm answering to these, impersonal pulsions of a demand and an offer, right? So this is usually a lot of how the content is made traditionally, but here we have a situation where you're actually fostering independent content to develop itself for reasons that aren't necessarily in that binary of like demand and offer. So then it's like, okay, so how do you build structure around that when you're not really trained to do that? I mean, we're often trained to almost imagine, we pretend things outside of that binary is inexistent on a daily basis in so many parts of our life. So now how do you do that as an artist, as a creator? But so you were a producer, but then also now you feel like you're a creator. In that sense, you see the division between both?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, because what you guys mentioned earlier about like finding the story along the way, and somehow people, in your words, put up with you. I often feel like that as well, so I'm just wondering how that plays out, during on-set productions.
Okay.
Well, whenever I make a film, McLaren's always his ghost is always in the room with me. And when I made this film on the women, because they were all women from the war years, my mother her ghost was in the room with me, because she was of that generation. But there is a little anecdote. There was a filmmaker at the film board called Jacques Leduc, who made 7 films about Quebec, called Chronique de la Vie Quotidienne. And he said to me, I asked him, I said something to him, it must be, kind of, each film was named after a day, like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and it covered all aspects of Quebec life. And I said to him, it must be very difficult as a Quebecois, like you're making these films and you want them to be seen outside Quebec. And he said, oh, I solved that problem. Because he said, I had, in the editing room with me, I had an imaginary pole. And he said every so often, when I didn't know what to do next, I would turn around and say, what should I do now? And so, it's interesting, it was his way of stopping and thinking and trying to put himself in the mindset of a viewer who knows nothing about Quebec. So I thought, and I'm sort of, that's what I've been imitating since then. That's why I had my mother in the editing room and the film on the women. I mean, she's been dead a long time ago.
Yeah, no, it's so I was also curious, just out of curiosity, do you when you talk about the films, do you do it while you're here, or is it do you talk to each other outside of this moment? How does it usually work? Just curious to learn more.
Well, there's usually a discussion, like, from the audience, it's questions, and
So the screening is usually way longer than it was tonight?
the screening is, well, we usually watch feature documentaries, so
Okay.
Around 80-90 minutes, or unless it's Dawn's film, might be 2 hours long. I've actually screened Frederick Wiseman's Ex Libris, which is it's a great documentary about the New York Public Library system. It's 4.5 hours, I think.
Wow.
The projector overheated and shut down, so we had to have a bathroom break. And of course, by then there was only like 3 people left. We didn't have a great discussion that evening, but I highly recommend it. It is in our projector, so have a look if you can. You can have all the bathroom breaks you need. But yeah, the discussion is usually here. I do notice though that people are talking amongst themselves for sure after I've said goodnight and thank you for coming.
And is there ever like a heated debate about any of the films? I'm just curious do you ever engage in like a continuation of like, because that's often what films want to be. I mean, I'm not a documentary filmmaker.
Maybe not with this crowd.
We
No?
don't, I don't think,
Okay, but
no, people usually agree with the documentarian's point of view and
Okay.
especially.
I remember going to a screening of, this is 1971, of Not a Love Story. And I in the Oakville Public Library, it was full, and there was men there and there was women there, and it was almost a riot. It was two of the Studio D, that's Women's Studio filmmakers were there. It was a marvelous event. People were shouting and yelling and
No.
anyway. But a Fred Wiseman anecdote. I used to know him quite well, and he made a film about the school system in Philadelphia called High School, and there's in the film there's a long scene with the vice principal who's in charge of discipline, and he has this student in front of him and he yells at him and tells him off, he gives him hell, and it's a very long scene. And Fred said to me, I had that scene in the film because I wanted the public to show, what a bastard this vice principal was, and what a way to run a school, to treat a boy like this, yelling and screaming at him. So he said they had the premiere in Philadelphia at the school. And after the screening, people were coming up and saying, wow, that was great. You really showed how they should be disciplined, And he said it was at that moment that I learned, when you make a documentary, you're throwing it out there, as the words he used with me were, the marketplace of ideas. You have no control when the chips are down on what the audience will think. So in other words, if you have a person who's a racist,
Right.
and you have a scene which attacks racism, they're not going to be affected by it. The most you can get at is the people who sort of hover in the middle somewhere, So that was a great lesson to me, to be, he said, he was discussing humility. You eventually have to be humble and not think, because he started making films, he was a lawyer, and he wanted to change the world, he said, and he realized he couldn't. And so he decided these films about institutions were to show the inner workings as honestly as he could, and let the viewer, and leave it to the viewers, to sort it out, because he knew he couldn't control them.
Yeah. I mean, a little note about, I was mentioning this kind of abstract idea of a mosaic of a story being built through the database, and it's interesting how since then we often have content that is identical but siloed to emphasize one's perspective prior. So we have these like depending on how you feel about certain things, the way the internet is designed, it gives you more of what you already know. So it's quite possible for you to have, for example, something like a story or some person or some character in the case of animation that basically is appropriated by two completely different groups that see a completely different thing in it, and are just coexisting in complete dissonance, and that is multiplied many times, and you're never going to know, especially with memification, how these things will develop, and sometimes they can come back at you and face you back with unexpected. They can look back at you as you're developing these things. So it's interesting how that idea that you have this gray area where you can influence a certain person, but if someone is just looking for what they already know, you're not going to reach out at all. That's it.
The biggest lesson I ever had was I appeared before a program committee at the film board, and I had given them, the proposal, and also a 30-minute sort of sampler of what the film was about. And so they looked at it, and I met with them in the afternoon, and this producer there, he ended up being the producer of a film you probably know, Flamenco at 5:15, David Wilson, and he said, Don, that reel, that 30-minute reel we saw was very interesting, But he says, I didn't know why I was looking at it. I said, I don't understand. He said, you are the filmmaker. You don't have to tell the person explicitly, but you have to you are the guide, and you have to somehow they have to understand from you why they should be looking at it. You might do it with narration, you might just do it with the editing, but you have to, you have to have this connection with the viewers, and this is why I started doing my own narrations. I realized, it was a very important thing that you can't, contrary to what McLaren thought, you just couldn't take a pile of film and throw it out there and say to the viewer, you sorted it out. So that was a very important lesson for me.
Yeah. And
Although I'm told people don't understand what I do.
and in our conversation 2 days ago, preparing for this, I think this led to how you developed this strategy of narration. Kind of things kind of fold into each other and weave into one topic, weaves into the other because of that.
That probably comes from Glenn Gould, you see.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, so I mean, I'm quite again really grateful you're all here. I don't know if anybody had a question or anything we can talk about while you're all here.
Well, actually, maybe now that you mentioned McLaren and how he would come and say, "Oh, I had a dream last night." Given that we've seen this film Turbine tonight, could you maybe speak a little bit about inspiration for Turbine that was actually a dream? If
Actually,
I remember correctly?
it's good because we actually sampled that same sound while we had the projector. Basically, what happened is I had this dream as I shared with Jelena. Now it's been a while. When we made the film, basically this same character. I dreamt of that character, and it was trying to talk to me, but I would be able to hear what the character was saying, but as I was gradually waking up, I realized it was just the sound of my air conditioner. So and from there, it came this idea that maybe when you're sleeping and when you're subconscious, you can decode the language of all the appliances in your house, and they're all there's this conspiracy of appliances in your home, and they're actually trying to reach out to you. But when you're awake, it's just the white noise in the room, and when you're decoding it with your pineal gland and your subconscious, you can kind of retrace what they're saying. So that's where that idea came from. And we had that same soundtrack with the projector, and maybe if anybody fell asleep at that time, maybe you would have decoded what it's trying to tell you.
Yeah, I was reading a novel the other day, and the novelist asked the question, what's the table doing when I'm not in the room?
Yeah. That's another funny anecdote is with Rick Alva, who's our sound designer. He's not here right now, but one thing he told me that was quite interesting. As a sound designer, this person works with a lot of the textures of different ondulations and waves. And I learned that a lot of films that have this dreamy state, he brought up, for example, the film that you've probably seen, Eraserhead, which is a classic, right? And apparently in that film, everything was recorded through the wood it's not through the air. It's actually, when you put your ear on a table and you scratch, you can really hear it. So there's like different ways to conduct sound. Apparently, all the scenes in that film are recorded through these stuffy platforms. It's not actually air. That's why it has that dreamy feeling, And a lot of that mindset was actually, from my understanding, applied when Turbine was designed as well.
So if there aren't any more questions, you guys don't have any more. I'm sure you have plenty more anecdotes and nuggets of wisdom to share, but we've had learned a lot tonight.
Don, you've been extremely generous. Thank you a lot for this, and thank everybody as well.
I'll just thank Alex and Don for coming tonight, and I hope we'll see you all in December 10th. Alanis Obomsaman will be here to screen Mother of Many Children and her latest, one of the